Santa Claus.
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 His legal name is Santa Claus.
I'm Santa Claus.
Santa Claus is running for Congress. He's running as an independent in Alaska and has been described as a democratic socialist. I'm sitting down with him today to talk about his love of Bernie Sanders, why he became Santa Claus, why the average Alaskan should vote for him, and much more. And the best part, Congressman Claus is a real possibility. We'll discuss how his campaign is doing so well and how he's standing out amongst the 50 candidates that are running in this election. You can also find links to Santa's Twitter, website, and previously shown media mentions down in the description below. And now, let's talk with Santa. Hello, Santa.
Hi, Nick.
I just want to really quickly get right into it. Who is Santa Claus, and why do you want Alaskans to vote for him?
Well, Santa Claus, which is my legal name, I'm up in North Pole, Alaska, where I'm a councilman for the city of North Pole and also the mayor pro tem currently. This is my final year of my second term on city council. And in between the two terms, I was on the Alaska Public Broadcasting Commission. But I'm up here and I'm running for the remainder of our congressman's term in the U.S. House of Representatives. He passed away in March, and his term ends the end of this year. So I'm looking forward to running. I am running, as you know, since we discovered each other on Twitter, and that's what I'm up here doing. It's my calling, as it were. I'd like to represent the state of Alaska in the Congress.
Awesome. Well, from the research that I've done about you, you're not originally from North Pole or even Alaska as a whole, and you obviously haven't always gone by the name Santa Claus. So how did you start that? How did you get to North Pole, and how did you become Santa?
Back in 2004, I grew out my beard. You can see it looks just the way it does now. And a lot of people said, oh, you got to do the Santa thing. So that Christmas time, I volunteered for about 30 nonprofits around Lake Tahoe, where I was living on the Nevada side. And it was well received. And that February, I'm also a monk in real life. That February, I was walking to the post office in Incline Village, this beautiful town up in the mountains at Lake Tahoe, and I was praying, what should I do with this appearance? How can I use it to help the greatest number of children? Since I had been a child advocate for quite some time before that. And right after my prayer, this white nondescript car came up the road towards me in the snow and the ice and stuff, and its windows were open, so I kind of glanced over, but I couldn't see who was driving. And right after my prayer in February, this male voice shouted out of the car, Santa, I love you. And the car sped off, never saw it again, and never knew who said that. But the next day, I kind of took it to heart and called up the county clerk in Nevada and began the name change process legally. So my name since 2005 has been Santa Claus. That makes kind of a long story short, but I use it for child advocacy. I'm not the ho mall Santa type person. I use it to get a hold of state and federal legislators to try and help them pass legislation to protect child health, safety, and welfare.
And is it true you actually moved to North Pole, Alaska, so it would have a better ring to it when you were talking to legislators, that you're Santa from the North Pole?
Yeah, it's a lot easier than saying, hey, this is Santa from Lake Tahoe. It's like, well, it could be Santa from anywhere, but Santa Claus from North Pole does have a good ring to it. And it's made it pretty easy for me to get a hold of US senators and governors, for example, their staffs, especially their policy directors or their chief of staff, if not the governor or the senator themselves.
Yeah, that's really cool. And like you mentioned, you have been using this more for advocacy. You're not, from my research, you're not the only person who's legally changed their name to Santa Claus, but it seems like a lot of people who have done it besides you have been doing it for, like you said, like a mall Santa or going to parties, things like that. And you also mentioned that you are a monk. And I know when you became a monk, you took a vow of poverty and you still live by that life. And so how has, I think, becoming Santa, but also having taken this vow of poverty and advocating for children, I think played into your politics as a whole?
Well, I think it's partly reflected in my campaign. I'm refusing to solicit or accept any kind of campaign contributions. I think people who are running for office and people who are in office should spend their time doing that. If you're running for office, then spend it, campaigning, et cetera, and perhaps fundraising. But once you're in office, I think the people who are incumbents who are running for office again should do their work in whatever role they're playing at the state, federal, or municipal or county levels as an elected official, and not spending their time campaigning and fundraising for their next term. So for me, I'm not an incumbent for Congress, so I'm spending my time campaigning and not fundraising in my case. So it's a little bit different from a lot of the other candidates who are out there running for office at whatever government level they're interested in.
Yeah, and I think that's awesome. I know you're currently running for the special election in August, and then there's the like the standard every 2-year election in November. So not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but assuming you win in August, if you were to become an incumbent, what would your plans be to run for November?
Absolutely not. Yesterday was the last day to file to run for the 2-year term.
Mhm.
So I didn't, and I'm not going to, and I'm not going to run even as a write-in for the 2-year term. I'm 75 years old. I'm running for the short term to finish up Congressman Don Young's term, the fellow who passed away, and try and get a clean slate for the next person. If I get elected, it'd be nice to have whoever comes in for the 2-year term have a nice clean slate to work with and move Alaska forward in Congress.
That's really cool. Um, and so, assuming that you do win, you go to Congress. Um, as you mentioned before, one of your biggest platforms that you've always fought on is child advocacy. I know you, when you were when you first moved to North Pole, you advocated for Aaron's Law, was it called, to help teachers report child abuse. And so you have a history of doing all of this. What would you do when you're in Congress for those few months?
Well, being an independent, progressive, democratic socialist, which is a mouthful, I would push Bernie's agenda. I have an affinity for Bernie Sanders and his platform. He spent 30 years developing it, and I'm not going to reinvent the wheel. So when people ask me about my platform, it's just go visit berniesanders.com/issues and look up whatever topic it is they might be interested in asking me about my platform. Makes it easier for me, makes it easier for them, and it's good for Bernie. So I sort of lean towards things like Medicare for all and union solidarity. I've been a union member for 51 years now, and am glad I am. I'm also for advocating for strong defense, especially up here in Alaska. We have a gigantic defense array since we're only 50 miles away from Russia. And I think we kind of have to keep that intact despite things like climate change and some other things affecting it, like infrastructure and whatever. So I'm all for beefing up the defense up here because I think it's warranted and we can do it. We're able to do it. I'm also for eradicating homelessness, preventing and treating drug addiction, providing the best public safety services possible, restoring the child tax credit, supporting women's right to choose, supporting protections for LGBTQIA plus communities, establishing train rail service between Alaska and Alberta, Canada. And Alberta already has train service to the lower 48 part of the United States, which makes it easier for those of us who might not want to drive to get down there if we don't want to fly, for example. I'm all for a clean environment, especially our water and coastal areas. The climate change is affecting things like subsistence capabilities and some other things that have an impact on Alaska. And Alaska, by the way, is a couple times the size of Texas. Most people don't realize it when they look at a map. They just see this little blob in the upper left-hand corner, but we're actually gigantic in land mass. I'm also for defending the ANWR, which is the Arctic Refuge up here, and against drilling, against subsidizing the oil, gas, and mineral industries and mining industries. So I think they play an important role. But I think just like any other company, if people want those things, they can buy them. Also, I've noticed recently some of the price gouging related to the energy industries, and I'm not too happy about that. For instance, they've got a lot of leases they're not even using, and I think if they're not using them, they should lose them and stop complaining about not being able to drill here and there. They just got a lot of fallow stuff that they're not even exploring that they already have under their control. So Alaska being a big energy resource state, that's a concern, plus our defense array, as I mentioned before. So those are two big things up here that I'm interested in. But I'm also interested because of our recent experience with COVID and some other episodes before that in the Medicare for All. I think people now are realizing, well, if we had Medicare for All, we're not going to get slammed with these gigantic medical bills. Also, I'm happy about the ranked choice voting system. I was an advocate for it, and I advocated for it for people that aren't familiar with ranked choice voting. The quote for me that's made the rounds is, ranked choice voting reduces partisanship, encourages more candidates to run, and boosts voter turnout, takes power away from special interests and out-of-state influence, and makes it almost impossible for anyone to rig an election. So what I'm seeing up here, we have 48 candidates now. So I know part of that quote is coming true. It has taken power away from the special interest and out-of-state influence. Some people raised a lot of money. I'm not, as I mentioned before, by design. And I'm not sure it's going to have that much of an impact on this particular election. All those other people trying to support candidates with gigantic donations to try and get them to do something. That's why I'm an independent. I'm not affiliated with a particular party. I'm left-leaning, as Bernie is. And I think if I were to make it to Congress, I would align with the progressives and try and get a few things done. But I also look for common ground with other legislators. And the fellow who passed away was Republican. The two senators we have in Alaska are Republican. And even though we have disparate political views, the common ground with Don, the fellow who passed away, he wanted to establish the Congressional Cannabis Caucus, which he did, and it's done pretty well. So I'd probably be supportive of that. And he was supportive of fisheries, which I am. I'm against mining next to Bristol Bay, which is a big salmon fishery up here. And I'm against, as I mentioned before, any kind of energy development in ANWR. So those things, with respect to Don, I think I would, try and help finish up a few of those things that he was interested in. And one of the senators is interested in our defense, especially. He's trying to reduce the number of military suicides and assaults in the military, and also provide for adequate housing for military, especially here in Alaska. So I'm all for that. That's some common ground. And with the other senator, she's interested in the impacts of the aging population, especially up here in Alaska. And since I'm 75, I can empathize with that interest. So there's some common ground to work with. So I'd like to help them do a few things and push the progressive agenda as well. So I think there's still plenty of common ground with that. It's in their best interest also for things like Medicare for All, et cetera. So that's how I perceive going to Congress just for the 19 weeks or so that I would be there if I'm elected.
Wow, yeah, and that's a lot.
There's a lot.
There's a lot to get done though, so it makes sense. Yeah, and you mentioned working with Republicans. I know Alaska as a whole during the Democratic primaries in 2016 went 82% to Bernie, and Bernie, even after dropping out in 2020, still did fairly well in the Democratic primaries. But I know you specifically from North Pole as a city councilman, I remember you worked on not banning marijuana dispensaries. Is that true?
That's correct. Yep. And I was also against an effort up here to put in a resolution, which turned into an ordinance, unfortunately, supporting, it was very poorly worded, but it was supporting Second Amendment rights. Um, I'm for banning assault weapons for the civilian population. I don't see any good reason for it. And I'm happy to expand on that, but I think there's plenty that I've been writing and
Yeah.
expounding on already that's out there, especially in some of the newspapers here in Alaska. So it's a little bit different take on things. But yeah, even as a council person, some things like that. Usually we're tasked at the council level, municipal level, at providing services. Excuse me, providing the services for. Sorry, providing services for our constituents here, and also running the city, as it were. So it has to do with taxes and things like that. So it's a bit different from the state level, which I experienced when I was on the Alaska Public Broadcasting Commission. It's a different way of addressing certain needs. And also at the federal level, I was a member of FEMA's National Defense Executive Reserve while I was director of the Terrorism Research and Communication Center. So I've seen how the federal government operates to a degree. So from my perspective, it's a little bit different from just the little city council part that I'm doing right now. I shouldn't say little, it's important, but it's scale wise, it's little compared to the state and federal obligations and responsibilities.
Yeah. And as a councilman, I think from what I saw, North Pole went over 70% to Trump. And so, how have you, being a Democratic Socialist, being kind of like an Alaskan Bernie Sanders almost, navigated that and been so successful in local politics there?
Part of it has to do with my name, I'm sure, pretty recognizable. And since I've been up here, I try and base everything I do in love, not so much the fear that's becoming so prevalent these days. And I think my particular message and perspective resonates with a lot of people, and especially people who have families. And it's been well received so far. I was reelected, which was a good sign. And a lot of people up here seem supportive of my campaign for Congress. So we'll see how it shakes out. I'm not sure exactly why, but I think because I care about other people, I love other people. I think that's a big factor.
Mm. Yeah, and I think that everything you're saying with love and compassion, that also ties in very well with your platform. And as you mentioned, your platform is almost identical to Bernie Sanders. He has done well in Alaska, and so that is a good sign for you. Is there anything specifically, though, that you disagree with Bernie Sanders about?
Not really disagree with him. I personally, if I wind up in a similar position, seems unlikely, but if I do, I'm not so sure. Like towards the end of his campaigns, sometimes he'll defer to another candidate as it gets closer to an election. If he thinks, like for instance, with what he did for Hillary, I was a Bernie supporter and still am. And back then he said, well, for the good of the United States and the Democratic Party, I'm asking you all to vote for Hillary. I'm not so sure I would have done that. In fact, even in this election, there are some other semi-progressive candidates. And I believe, I say what I believe in what I say. And if people think that's going to detract from somebody else's campaign, then perhaps their candidate should put forth what I'm putting forth. I'm not going to change my platform and water it down just to make it easier for some other candidate or party. That's why I'm kind of against political parties in the first place, even existing. So I would do that differently from what Bernie did if the opportunity ever arose. And sometimes he'll do trade-offs like most politicians do. Some of it had to do with that Second Amendment stuff, and because he's living in a state that has a lot of subsistence and hunting things going on, which I understand. I mean, I appreciate. I was in law enforcement and public safety for a very long time. I was armed part of that time, and so I don't have a problem with guns or weapons, in general. But I do have a problem with all these mass shootings that have been occurring over a very, very protracted period of time. So those are some of the things that I would do differently, I think, from Bernie. But that doesn't mean there's a difference in our platform. It just means that there's a difference in how we move things forward.
Yeah, that makes sense. And speaking of the primary, and you talked about advocating for ranked choice voting, which I totally agree with, and I think that is extremely important. And ranked choice voting is one of the aspects that can help decrease the power of political parties and make it less important that you're either Democrat or Republican, which I think your candidacy has actually exemplified the fact that you've been able to do very well when this ranked choice voting has, I think, been part of helping that. And so just to go into really quick how you're doing in the election, I saw it was from the Alaskan survey. I wrote it down. Alaskan Survey Center, and I saw that you tweeted it as well, that you're within the top 4 candidates, and I think that's really good because
that's in the top 4 candidates regarding positive and negative perceptions. So this company gauges their positive, value, whatever, and they gauge their negatives as well, and then they subtract the negatives from the positive, yielding a net. And I think I was at plus 13, which put me at the top of the 4 that they were looking at this particular point most recently. So I was pretty pleased, but that goes back to what you were saying about being a little blue dot in a red sea over here in the city of North Pole and the state of Alaska in general. So I was pleased to see that. And those things can change, overnight easily, for better or for worse, for a particular candidate. So I usually don't rely on polls, but it was kind of refreshing. I mean, every candidate that sees something good is going to say, "Oh, that's great," And so I got the opportunity to do that this time around.
yeah, and that's awesome. And assuming you do get through the primary, which is of the top 4, and the 4 candidates left are running that ranked choice, do you think that ranked choice will be beneficial for you both for name recognition and as an independent?
I'm pretty sure it'll be good for me. I'm not so sure how other candidates perceive it. I have the name recognition advantage, as does one of the other candidates. And others have name recognition in the state of Alaska because they've either been in government service before or they're well known for some other reason. And with the ranked choice voting, even name recognition, even though it comes into play, it's hard to tell what element is going to be the deciding, element. I think each element that pollsters, for example, are considering is going to be kind of suppressed a little bit just because of the ranked choice voting system, just the way it's set up. So if some people in the ranked choice voting, people just vote the top 4 in order of preference. They don't have to vote for all 4 or even anybody for that matter, but they can vote for 4. And if no one the first time around gets more than 50% of the vote, then they take into consideration people's second choice. And then if nobody, in addition to the first stuff. So if nobody gets 50%, then it goes to a 3rd and then a 4th round until somebody is liked or is preferred at some level by more than 50% of the the voters, which I think is great, because otherwise, if you have like our race with 48 people, if somebody got 10% of the vote, that might be a big deal out of 48 people. Well, if they get elected, what are the other 90 people, or the other 90% of the voters going to think?
Right.
This election sucks. So this way, at least with ranked choice voting, at least 50% of the people say, oh, that's Kennedy to be okay. So that's a lot better than 10%, for example. So I'm all for it. I think it makes it better for the state of Alaska. I think a lot of other states and counties, municipalities, et cetera, and cities are going to catch on and start to implement ranked choice voting. And with all the talk over the last 4 or 5, 6 years about elections and stealing elections and all that stuff, that kind of puts ranked choice voting puts that to rest, because no one can exercise enough control to really skew or rig an election. I think it'd be too hard to do, and so that would be refreshing in itself.
Yeah. Yeah, and from what I've seen, I think the ranked choice voting really helps, and it shows that if you were to go to the general, you'd do very well. But I guess I know you're really busy, so just one final question. How do you feel about June 11th for the primary?
I think I'll probably wind up in the top 4, but if I don't, I'm fine. My term on city council will end. I'm 75. I got plenty of stuff that I would like to do. So one way or another, I hope people will vote for me. I think I'd be great in Congress to serve out Don's term, and it'd be good for whoever might follow me. So it's kind of a win-win-win. Plus, it would put Alaska definitely on the map for people who don't think much about it, and definitely good for North Pole, because most people in the United States, I would say probably 1% of the people in the United States know that there even is a North Pole, Alaska, let alone
Yeah.
know anybody here. So if I were in North Pole, which I am, and I knew Santa, which I do, I'd be voting for Santa Claus for the U.S. House of Representatives special election.
Yeah, and hopefully everyone thinks the same way.
Thank
Well,
you.
thank you very much for talking with me, and good luck on June 11th.
Thanks, Jack. Good luck to you as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for watching. And again, you can check out the description for more of Santa, more info on the Alaskan primary, and an informative video about ranked choice voting. Thank you for supporting everything I'm doing, and goodbye.